Om Ajnanatimirandasya Gananjana Shalakaya Chakshur Anmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Shtapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamaham Dadati Swapadantikam Vandehang Shri Guru Shri Yuta Pada Kamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavam Cha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunatan Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadhunam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakanvitamscha He Krishna Karuna Sindho Dina Bandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vanchakalpa Tarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasadi Gaur Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Okay, so from what I understand, we're on Canto 9, Chapter 9, text 34 to 42, the Dynasty of Amshuman. So this segment is talking about King Amshuman. He performed austerities to bring the celestial Ganges to earth, but was unable, as was his son Dilipa. So he made these various austerities, but he wasn't able to bring the Ganges to earth. However, his grandson Bhagirath was able to bring the Ganges down to earth under the condition that Shiva would break the fall and saintly persons would release Ganga from the sins that were left behind by sinful people when they bathed in her waters. Later on, which is the section we're in now, we find that Saudasa, he was cursed by Vashishta Rishi to become a Rakshasa. Then later he devours the husband of a Brahmani who cursed him to die when he would try to approach his own wife for begetting children. So finally we get to Maharaj Katvanga, who was born in the same line, which is where we are today. So let's go to the verse here. This is text 9934. Brahmane viksha didhishum purushadena bhakshitam so chantiat manam urvishang asapat kupita sati. So the translation of this verse is, when the chaste wife of the Brahmana saw that her husband, who was about to discharge semen, had been eaten by the man-eater, she was overwhelmed with grief and lamentation. Thus, she angrily cursed the king. Yasman me bhakshita papa kamartaya patistvaya tavapi mrityur adhanad akrita pragyadarshitaha. O foolish, sinful person, because you have eaten my husband when I was sexually inclined and desiring to have the seed of a child, I shall also see you die when you attempt to discharge semen in your wife. In other words, whenever you attempt to sexually unite with your wife, you shall die. 36. Eva mitra saham saptva patiloka parayana tad asthini samidhignau prasya bhartur gatim gata. Thus the wife of the Brahmana cursed King Sodasa, also known as Mitra Saha. Then, being inclined to go with her husband, she set fire to her husband's bones, fell into the fire herself, and went with him to the same destination. Vishapodvadashabdante Maitunasya Maitunaya Samudyataha Vigyapya Brahmani Shapang Mahishya Sanivaritaha. After 12 years, when King Shodasa was released from the curse by Vashishta, he wanted to have sexual intercourse with his wife, but the queen reminded him about the curse of the Brahmani, and thus he was checked from sexual intercourse. Ata urdvam satatyaja Stri Shukam Karmana Prajaha Vashishtas Tad Anugyato Mayadayantyam Prajam Adat. After being thus instructed, the king gave up the future happiness of sexual intercourse and by destiny remained sonless. Later, with the king's permission, the great sage Vashishta begot a child in the womb of Madayanti. Savai sapta samagarbham abhibhrana vyajayata jagne smasnodasham tasyaha so smakastena katyate. Madayanti bore the child within the womb for 7 years and did not give birth. Therefore, Vashishta struck her abdomen with a stone, and then the child was born. Consequently, the child was known as Asmuk, the child born of a stone. Asmakad baliko yagye yastribhi Parirakshitaha nari kavacha iti ukto niksatre mulako bhavat. From Ashmaka, Balika took birth. Because Balika was surrounded by women and therefore saved from the anger of Parashuram, he was known as Nari Kavacha, one who is protected by women. When Parashuram vanquished all the Kshatriyas, Bhalika became the progenitor of more Kshatriyas. Therefore, he is known as Mulaka, the root of the Kshatriya dynasty. Tato Dasharathas Tasmad Putra Aidavidistataha Raja Vishvasaho Yasya Katvangash Chakravarti Abhut. From Bhalika came a son named Dasarath. from Dasarat came a son named Idavidi, and from Idavidi came King Vishvasaha. The son of King Vishvasaha was the famous Maharaj Katvanga. And so here's the verse that actually has a purport. The final verse will read, Yo Devar Artito Daityan Avadid Yudhidurjaya Muhurtam Ayur Gyat Vaitya Swapuram Sandadhemana. King Katvanga was unconquerable in any fight. Requested by the demigods, King Katvanga was unconquerable in any fight. Requested by the demigods to join them in fighting the demons, he won victory, and the demigods, being very pleased, wanted to give him a benediction. The king inquired for them about the duration of his life and was informed that he had only 1 moment more. Thus he immediately left his palace and went to his own residence, where he engaged his mind fully on the lotus feet of the Lord. So here's the purport. The example of Maharaj Katvanga in performing devotional service is brilliant. Maharaj Katvanga engaged himself for only a moment in devotional service to the Lord, but he was promoted back to Godhead. Therefore, if one practices devotional service from the beginning of his life, surely he will return home back to Godhead without a doubt, asamshaya. In Bhagavad Gita, the word asamshaya is used to describe the devotee. There the Lord gives this instruction, Maya sakta mana partha yogam yunjanmad ashraya asamshayam samagram mam yata gyas tat trunu. Now hear, O son of Pratha, Arjuna, how by practicing yoga in full consciousness of me, with mind attached to me, you can know me in full, free from doubt. And that's from Bhagavad Gita, chapter 7, text 1. The Lord also instructs, Janma karma chame dibyam evam yo veti tatvataha tvadeham punar janma naiti mam iti sorjuna. One who knows the transcendental nature of my appearance and activities does not, upon leaving the body, take his birth again in this material world, but attains my eternal abode, O Arjuna. And that's from Bhagavad Gita, chapter 4, text 9. Therefore, from the very beginning of one's life, one should practice Bhakti Yoga, which increases one's attachment for Krishna. If one daily sees the deity in the temple, makes offerings by worshiping the deity, chants the holy name of the personality of Godhead, and preaches about the glorious activities of the Lord as much as possible, he thus becomes attached to Krishna. This attachment is called asakti. When one's mind is attached to Krishna, my asakta manaha, one can fulfill the mission in one's human birth. If one misses this opportunity, one does not know where he is going, how long he will remain in the cycle of birth and death, and when he will again achieve the human form of life and the chance to return home back to Godhead. The most intelligent person, therefore, uses every moment of his life to render loving service to the Lord. Yo Devar Artito Daityan Avadhid Yudhi Durjaya Muhurtam Ayur Gyat Vaitya Swapuram Sandadhe Manaha. So this section will kind of discuss mainly Maharaj Katvanga, but we started, excuse me, we started by hearing about the dynasty of Amshuman and about how Maharaj Sagara wanted to perform a horse sacrifice, but the horse was taken, and his sons tried to find the horse. And later on, when they found uh, the horse was with Kapila, and his sons mistakenly thought that Kapila had taken the horse, which he had not. And they attempted to attack him. Of course, they were all burned to ashes. Now, because of their offense to Kapila, there was an attempt to redeem them. And we see that one group of sons were burned by Kapila Dev, and Amsaman, who was part of another group of sons, prayed to Kapila Dev to deliver his uncles. Actually, Amsaman was a little further down the road, but although he prayed to have Sagara's sons, who were his uncles, delivered, he would not be able to do it. But Kapila Dev would give him the clue of how they would be delivered by bringing the Ganges to earth. And eventually, Bhagirath was able to do this by his austerities. He brought the he brought the Ganges to earth, and was able to deliver by touching the waters of the Ganges to the ashes of his great uncles. So Lord Shiva was supposed to come to earth, but the water was too forceful. I mean, the Ganges was supposed to come to earth, but her waters were too forceful. So Lord Shiva agreed to catch the water on his head so the waters wouldn't bore a hole into the earth. And thus the Ganges comes to earth. Now, because sinful people bathe in the Ganges and get their sins taken, the Ganga did not want to absorb all these sins. As a result, um, the benediction was that the Ganga would not have to absorb the sins, but saintly persons who come to take bath at the sins, they take away the sins, just as sinful persons deposit their sins in the Ganges when they bathe. Saintly persons take those sins away from the Ganges when they bathe. So in this way, we see that saintly persons are really the place of pilgrimage. And Maharaj Katvanga, who we're talking about now, is further down this dynasty. And he, as we just read, was given a benediction by the demigods when he won victory fighting against the demons. And he asked how long his life would be. And he finds out that literally his life is only a few more moments. So he leaves aside his kingdom and his palace, and he immediately focuses on the Supreme Lord. And in this way, by focusing on the lotus feet of the Supreme Lord, he uh, gains the real purpose of human life. And this is actually not just King Katvanga's position, but this is everybody's position, because there is no way that we can be sure when we might leave this world. We could leave this world at any moment. And so Katvanga knew that his life was only a muhurta further, but we don't know. We might or might not have any moments left. Sometimes people die suddenly and unexpectedly, and we don't know where this can or when this could take place. Sometimes we see in the greatest of danger, people will be saved from calamity or death. And sometimes in the greatest of safety, someone will suddenly die unexpectedly. So we do not know at what point our hour will approach. And therefore, we should engage ourselves very carefully and strongly in devotional service, because if we're engaged in devotional service, whether we die now or we die in 100 years, it's all the same for someone engaged in devotional service. And Prabhupada quotes this particular verse from Bhagavad Gita, Maya Sakta Manoye Mam Yogam Yunjan Madashraya Asamshayam Samagram Mam Yata Gyasasi Touch Trinu. This is the first verse of chapter 7. The Supreme Personality of Godhead said, "Now hear, O son of Pritha, how by practicing yoga in full consciousness of me, with mind attached to me, you can know me in full, free from doubt." So here in this verse of Bhagavad Gita, Krishna is saying how Arjuna can know him in full. And in the other verse that Prabhupada quoted, 4.9, Janma karma chame divyam evam yoveti tattvataha tyaktva deham punar janma naiti mamati. So Arjuna, one who knows the transcendental nature of my appearance and activities does not, upon leaving the body, take his birth again in the material world, but attains my eternal abode. So one who knows um, the nature of his appearance and activities does not take birth again. In other words, he returns to the spiritual world. And as we just heard in verse 7:1, how do we know him in full? Uh, by practicing yoga in consciousness of me. That way you can know him. And what kind of yoga is Krishna talking about? We learned in chapter 6 of Bhagavad Gita that kind of yoga is Bhakti Yoga. In other words, engaging in service. So this is the answer to all questions and the solution to all problems, that we just need to engage in devotional service to the Supreme Lord. And if we engage in devotional service, chanting his name, as Prabhupada says, singing and standing before the deities, if we engage in service, trying to help others to become influenced to take up Krishna consciousness, then certainly we will go back home, back to Godhead. Maharaj Katvanga had only a moment or two to do this, and he focused his consciousness on the Supreme and attained the Supreme abode. And certainly if we do this, we will also attain the Supreme abode and go back home, back to Godhead. So let me ask if there are any questions at this point from anyone in our group here who is
Hi, Krishna
listening.
Maharaj. Yes.
Hare Krishna.
Yeah. A couple, hopefully, quick things. One was, well, since we just finished talking about King Katvanga, it just seems a little misleading, this part of the story that, it looks like he was able to devote himself only at the last minute and attain perfection. But do we have any indication that he was devotional like his whole life, not just at the last minute?
I don't know. I haven't read that in Bhagavatam, and I don't know it from any other source. It's quite likely that to some extent he must have been devotionally inclined, or otherwise he wouldn't have been able to suddenly, switch like that. But that's also possible that he knew, at least theoretically, that the goal of life is to devote oneself to the Supreme. And when he learned that his life was over, he thought, well, there's certainly nothing else for me to do now except for devote myself. So he changed that way. And this is, a possibility too. So which way it is, I don't know, whether he was somewhat devotionally inclined and immediately switched, or whether at the last minute he theoretically had known before, but now, because there was no time remaining, he immediately embraced the idea of focusing on the Supreme Lord. So we
But
know that,
mm,
yeah.
No, I mean, I'm just saying that, we have it drilled into us that, we cannot expect to, lead our life in a non-devotional way and suddenly, at the last minute, expect to remember Krishna, because our mind hasn't been trained in that way. So, that's what made me ask about this,
Yeah, I think generally that's true. Um, but sometimes people do turn around at the last minute. That's also possible. So I would say that it's hard to say. There's no reference that I can give or I can quote at this moment in time. Maybe at some future point I'll run across something that gives me an understanding of which way this really plays out. But it appears that, you know, uh, he did turn around, and whether it was completely from a 0 point to a sudden, full devotional point, or whether he was already somewhat devotional. It's hard to know. But as you
hmm
say, probably he was somewhat inclined devotionally already.
Maharaj, I just had one other quick thing. I think was it Saudasha who was um, cursed that if he tried to engage in sex, he would immediately die. Which personality was that?
Yeah, that was, he has several names that he's mentioned by in the Bhagavatam, Sodasa. So he was entertaining Vashishta Muni, and Vashishta Muni uh, was he made he had one of his cooks make some food for Vashishta Muni, but previously Sodasa had killed one of two brother Rakshasas in the forest, and he decided not to kill the other one. I don't know what the circumstances were under which he killed the first one, but he let the brother go. The one brother he killed and the other brother he let go, but the one that he let go wanted vengeance. So this other brother went to work as his cook. And when he found that Vashishta was coming, he wanted to offend Vashishta. So he cooked human flesh in with the food, and that was served to Vashishta. And Vashishta mistakenly cursed Saudasa for this offense, even though it wasn't really Sodasa's fault. He hadn't intentionally done it. It was a frame up by this brother of the Rakshasa. And so he was cursed to become um, Rakshasa, and he had this black spot on his leg, and he's also known as Kalma Sabhada, which means black leg or something like that. So eventually, this Rakshasic tendency came out when he was again noticing a Brahmani and her husband, and he suddenly became attracted to eat the brahmana, and he did that even though his wife pleaded against it, and she then cursed him to die when he would approach his wife for sex. So that's kind of the story in a nutshell. It's kind of a complicated story, and since we're going through rapid fire about 7, 8, 9, 10 generations here, we go through all these different episodes that happen with these different predecessors to get to Katvanga.
Yeah. So my question though is that I think it's in verse 9:937 where it says that even though he had been released from the curse, still there was a risk of death if he were to engage in sex. Or
Mhm.
am I confusing something? I didn't understand how he could simultaneously be released from the curse yet still be subject to death.
He was released from the curse of Vashishta, but not from the curse of the Brahmani. That was the, the issue
Uh
here.
huh.
He had been cursed twice, once
Uh
by
huh.
Vashishta and once by the Brahmani. So, and it's interesting that King Sodasa, he felt that although he couldn't have children, he did have children by Vashishta. He had no hard feelings with Vashishta, but you know, the fact that he'd been cursed by the Brahmani was still in force. So he couldn't have sex with his own wife. So he was released from Vashishta's curse because Vashishta, after a while, learned that it was really this Rakshasa that had set Sodasa up for this, you know, serving of human flesh that offended him. So he was released from the one curse, but not the other. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes. So when he was released from the curse of Vashishta, that meant that he no longer what? He no longer had to be a Rakshasa, or what was the release? What was the result of the
Yeah,
release from?
that's a good question. I don't know in what sense he was released from it. Um, uh, I think that's what happened. He was released from being impelled towards Rakshasic tendencies, but that was also already after this other episode happened, as I understand it. So he
Mm.
that didn't release him from the Brahmani's curse because he'd already eaten her husband, so that didn't help.
Hmm. Okay.
Somebody's asking if the Pandava's father was on a similar curse. Well, yeah, but it wasn't. The reason for the curse was different. We see that curses play a big role in the Vedic literatures, which shows how much people were preoccupied with honor and also how a person who seemingly was powerless could cause the downfall of someone who was powerful simply by invoking a curse on them, using their personal acquired austerity to bring about the downfall of someone else. And so, you know, often in Vedic literatures, it's mentioned that we are not really supposed to curse people. Although sometimes devotees do curse people, but they do so not out of anger or out of vengeance, but they do so to give those people a chance for spiritual life, which is exactly what um, let's see, the situation I was just thinking of. What Narada Muni did with Manigriva and Nalakuvera. He also cursed them, but not with a sense of vengeance or vituperation, but he cursed them so that they would actually get the chance to meet Krishna and their lives would be perfected. So it was an actual benediction curse. But oftentimes in these stories in Mahabharata, it's just a curse that is a vengeance, a curse of vengeance. And in this way, someone has to suffer for the result of something they did. And this was the case with the Brahmani cursing Maharaj Sodasa. Um, any final questions? We have, just 3 minutes or something like that.
Athena.
Athena has her hand up. Okay.
Hare Krishna Maharaj, Shantavat Pranams. So nice to see you on this channel. I've missed your classes.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna. My question is somewhat related to Gail's first question. And I guess it's actually less of a question, but more of seeking your opinion and your thoughts. It's very interesting that, again, at least we are taught in, of course, we always want to be God conscious. Therefore, whatever we do is preparing us for that final quote unquote test, that final, at the end of life, will we remember Krishna? And if we do, at the time of death, we obtain what we remember or are thinking of, so we could go back to Godhead. And so, and of course, I would say as a practicing devotee, you love being God conscious because there's that bliss. It's it's transcendental. So it's not just for, the means of, for that final test, let me just remember Krishna so I can go back to Godhead. But in this example of Katvanga Maharaj, he, as you mentioned, we're not sure if he was God conscious at all, if he was starting from zero, but at the very end of his life, he engaged himself in devotional service, and Krishna promoted him back to Godhead. It's not like there was some intermediary. He went to, this planet and then took rebirth again, and then and then just continues devotional service. And this brings back to, I think most people on this channel knows that I am a big advocate for interfaith, for my own personal experiences. And if you believe that there are also bona fide paths, then what they say in their Shastra must be true. So therefore, how do we reconcile the philosophies? We believe what we have in our Shastra, but could there be more? And I similarly apply that to their Shastra as well. But in the Abrahamic faiths, from my understanding, it's very binary. It's up or down. You make it or you not. You only have one life, like to perfect your life. Not that we say, okay, there's reincarnation. They, for the most part, don't believe that. And when they ask for our pramana, we point to Bhagavad Gita. Well, there's many references, but I'll point to Bhagavad Gita 7:19, saying, Krishna himself says, after many births and deaths, he who is actually in knowledge surrenders unto me. So that is a proof that there are multiple lives. And so therefore, if we don't make it fully, then we're given another chance. And I would say that's mercy. Mercy means that we get something that we don't deserve. In our epistemology, we decided to be separate from Krishna. So therefore, we don't deserve hypothetically go back. So he gives us many chances to realize him. However, in the Abrahamic faiths, it's up or down. It's not that there's reincarnation. So if you take such a stark, I don't say extreme or binary look at it, it's God is all merciful. For them, it's like the full-blown mercy, the fullest mercy. If you remember God even once, you can go back to him. You do your prayer even once, you think, and even if you were a murderer and you just repent, you will go back to God because he's so merciful. Whereas I would say, well, mercy just again means you deserve something you receive something you don't deserve. But to them, that sounds so hard-hearted. To them, that means God isn't merciful. And in this, if we just take this verse and see that Maharaj Kavanga just once, perhaps he started at zero, but just once realized, wow, I'm going to leave my body. I've heard it. I've never engaged in it, but I heard throughout my life that I should perform devotional service. And now I will. And he made it back to Godhead. So is that not proof that if we are even just slightly God conscious, that in our life, if we just remember God, that we will go back to Godhead? Why is there even more rebirths? Why is there even an intermediary? Okay, you're just elevating at least, because my argument is you should be happy that even if you're just going up, you're taking level steps. You should be happy. You're going towards the final destination. But for them, that's not. So I guess not full mercy. And here,
well, you're going way over time, so I won't have a chance to reply to any of this.
If there is extra time from Gausharang Prabhu, since we don't have Radha Miladar Darshan, I'd love for your comment.
Can we go a few more moments, or should we just cap it off? I'll ask for our moderator here.
Yes, Mars, we have time because we're not having darshan currently.
Okay. So anyway, let me just kind of reply to that so we don't go super over time. As Prabhupada generally puts it, the Vedas are like the unabridged dictionary, and the other, scriptures are like the abridged dictionary. There are things in the Vedas that aren't in the other literatures, and there are things in the other literatures, and every one of those things is somewhere in the Vedic literature. Now, what happens is that we understand the big picture, and there are a lot of things that are oftentimes confused by other religions. One of them is the difference between heavenly planets and the actual abode of Krishna, or the abode of the Supreme Lord. There's almost no differentiation made. In fact, people assume that heaven is where God is, but actually we know that God doesn't spend a lot of time in heaven. He actually is in the spiritual world. And heaven is the place where one gets rewarded for one's pious activities. It's a temporary place. It's not where we want to go. Yet for the Abrahamic religions, that's the whole goal, because the idea of there being an abode of God beyond heaven is missing from those religions. And the idea of the purpose of life being to serve God with no desire for any reward is the highest thing. That is missing. Rather, generally speaking, in most other religious traditions, the idea is to serve God with the idea that God will then give you what you want. So, in other words, God becomes indirectly a tool for one to gain one's own particular flavor of happiness. This is a very different concept. Now, having said that, I think there are people in the various other Abrahamic religions and other religions who do realize something beyond this, but generally speaking, such people are rare. And they may somehow or other come to that understanding. However, in the Vaishnav tradition, if we're following it, we understand the distinction between these things and we understand the process to get there. And uh, it is possible that someone can be perfectly focused on the Supreme in a moment and make a sudden, evolution from 0 to 100%. Generally, it doesn't work that way, but it can happen. There's nothing that says it can't. But generally, it's described, by Rupa Goswami that there are 9 stages of devotional service. One goes from Ado Shraddha to Tatu Sadhu Sangha, from faith to association of devotees to accepting a bona fide spiritual master, engaging in purification. And then it goes on up, as Prabhupada mentioned in the purport, to asakti, which is attachment. And then from asakti, we go up to bhava and then prema. So generally, there are these levels, and one goes from one to the other, gradually becoming more and more purified. So that's usually how it happens. And when someone's in the Bhagavad Gita or Bhagavatam is said to go back home, back to Godhead, we may or may not know that they went back in that very next incarnation, or possibly there was some intermediate uh, uh, lifetime or something that occurred between when they more or less perfected themselves and when they actually went back home, back to Godhead. So I would just point to those things, and that's about all I can say. I don't have the time to really elaborate more fully, but I thank you very much for your question, and I thank our Gail also for her questions, and I hope that you all have a good week here in Krishna consciousness, and I will give this back over to our moderator, Gora Sharana, and Hare Krishna. All right. So at this point, I will disconnect and thank you very much for your kind attention and for your interest in trying to understand Srimad Bhagavatam, which is kind of the science of spiritual life in great detail. So all
Thank you.
glories to the Vaishnava devotees of the Lord, all glories to all of you. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna. Thank you so much, Maharaj, for your wonderful class and answer. Haribo.